They arrested her at a rest stop. Next day, she was the judge. Welcome to Tales by Orion. Let's uncover what really happened. The relentless, shimmering heat of the desert highway blurred the horizon into a wavering, mirage-like line. Inside the air-conditioned cocoon of his sleek, black sedan, Judge Alistair Hayes felt a familiar, almost weary, sense of detachment from the harsh, sun-bleached landscape. He was on his way back from a legal conference in a distant, anonymous city, a conference filled with the same predictable speeches, the same self-congratulatory platitudes, the same carefully orchestrated networking rituals that defined his professional world. At 57, Judge Hayes was a man of considerable, if understated, power. His courtroom was his kingdom, a place of quiet, intellectual rigor where he presided over complex civil litigation with a reputation for scrupulous fairness, a keen legal mind, and an almost surgical precision in dissecting convoluted arguments. His silver-streaked hair was impeccably combed, his dark, conservative suits tailored the biting to perfection, his eyes, the color of a stormy sea, holding a keen intelligence and a profound, almost weary, understanding wind whipped across the expansive, desolate plains, stirring dust devils across the cracked, sun-score of human folly. He was a man accustomed to control, to a world governed by precedent and statute, a world where fact shed earth. The air thrummed with the distant rumble of 18-wheelers, the lonely cry of a hawk, and the hushed, almost imperceptible hum of a nation in constant, restless motion. In the heart of this vast, empty were paramount, and emotions were a messy, unreliable variable to be carefully filtered, analyzed, and ultimately dismissed in favor of cold landscape, amidst a scattering of sun-bleached gas stations and anonymous fast food joints, sat a small, unassuming, hard, legal reasoning. Yet, despite his formidable intellect and his unwavering commitment to the letter of the law, their rest stop, a brief oasis of concrete and faded green paint in a sea of brown. It was here, in this forgotten, was a quiet, almost melancholic loneliness about him, a sense of a man who had perhaps sacrificed too much a corner of the American heartland, that Judge Alistair Sterling, a man whose name was synonymous with power, justice, and in the altar of his profession, who had become so accustomed to his role as a detached, impartial arbiter that he had almost unyielding commitment to the letter of the law, found himself stranded. He was not, at this moment, the formidable forgotten, the messy, unpredictable, and often profoundly unjust realities of the world outside his courtroom. The long, monotonous drive Judge Sterling of the Federal Circuit Court, a man whose piercing gaze and incisive intellect could wither the arguments of the most seasoned, was a rare opportunity for introspection, a chance to shed the heavy robes of his judicial authority and simply be a man. A litigator's. He was simply Alistair, a man in his late 50s, his bespoke suit rumpled, his silver man driving a car, listening to the soft, melancholic strains of classical piano concerto, his thoughts as vast and empty as the streak hair disheveled, his expensive Italian leather shoes coated in a fine layer of dust, his luxury sedan a desert sky. He decided to pull over at a small, sun-bleached rest stop. A dusty oasis of cracked marvel of German engineering had succumbed to a sudden, catastrophic engine failure, leaving him utterly and infuriatingly powerless asphalt and a single, forlorn-looking vending machine to stretch his legs and escape the confines of his climate-controlled world, a castaway on a desolate island of asphalt and sun-bleached weeds. He had spent the last 2 hours. The heat hit him like a physical blow, a stark, immediate reminder of the raw, untamed power of the desert on the phone, his usual crisp, commanding tone giving way to a barely concealed, seething frustration as he navigated the labyrinth. He bought a bottle of lukewarm water from the vending machine and was leaning against his car, enjoying the strange, desolating bureaucracy of roadside assistance, premium automotive clubs, and local repair shops that seemed to operate on a different, more languid beauty of the landscape. When he saw it, a local sheriff's patrol car, its lights flashing silently in the shimmering understanding of time. He was a man accustomed to control, to a world that bent to his will, a world where heat, pulling up behind a battered, aging sedan a few hundred feet away. A black woman in her late schedules were sacrosanct, and inefficiency was a cardinal sin. This sudden, enforced helplessness was anathema to him. A Golf 40s, perhaps, with a cascade of elegant, graying braids and a face that spoke of a quiet, weary dignity, had also pulled over, likely to rest, to escape the relentless heat. Two officers emerged from the patrol car, their movement seeing reminder of the universe's utter indifference to his power, his wealth, his meticulously ordered life. As he waited for the tow truck that had been promised, with a distinct lack of conviction, for some time this afternoon, Alistair paced slow, deliberate, almost predatory, their mirrored sunglasses reflecting the harsh, unforgiving sun. They approached the woman's car, the perimeter of the small, shabby rest stop, his movements tight, controlled, a physical manifestation of his barely contained fury. Their postures radiating an authority that seemed disproportionate to the sleepy, desolate setting. Judge Hayes, his legal instincts honed by decades on the bench, felt a small, almost imperceptible prickle of unease. He couldn't hear place was a study in quiet, unassuming neglect. A few picnic tables with peeling paint, a set of restrooms that he dared not investigate, a single, flickering vending machine offering a sad selection of stale-looking snacks. He was a man accustomed to their words, but he could read the body language, the subtle, almost invisible dance of power and intimidation. He did the hushed opulence of his chambers, the quiet dignity of the courtroom, the rarefied air of the cities most saw the woman's initial confusion, then her dawning, weary resignation as the officers' questioning grew more insistent, their gestures exclusive clubs. This place, with its scent of diesel fumes, hot asphalt, and a faint, underlying hint of despair more aggressive. He saw the way they looked at her old, battered car, at the color of her skin, was a foreign country, a world he had only ever observed from the climate-controlled comfort of his speeding car. He was their expressions a mixture of suspicion, of contempt, of an ingrained, almost casual, prejudice that made his stomach clench. He about to retreat to the relative shelter of his dead sedan when he noticed her. She was a woman in her late 40s, had seen this play out 1,000 times in his courtroom, in the dry, dispassionate language of police reports, in perhaps early 50s, with skin the color of rich, dark earth, her hair a cascade of intricate braids adorned with the carefully constructed narratives of legal arguments. But to witness it here, in the raw, unfiltered light of day, was few discreet silver beads. She was dressed in simple, practical clothes, worn jeans, a faded but clean cotton blouse different. It was a stark, uncomfortable reminder of the profound, often unbridgeable, chasm between the idealized world of legal theory and the harsh, brutal reality of lived experience. The interaction escalated. The officers' voices grew louder, their gestures sturdy work boots. She sat at one of the peeling picnic tables, a worn, leather-bound book open and more demanding. The woman, though clearly intimidated, maintained a quiet, unwavering dignity, her posture erect, her gaze steady her lap, her expression one of quiet, serene contemplation as she gazed out at the vast, empty horizon. Then, with a sudden, shocking finality, the officers moved in. They pulled the woman from her car, her protests profound, almost regal, stillness about her, a quiet dignity that seemed utterly at odds with her humble surroundings, with the shabby a faint, unheard whisper against the vast, indifferent silence of the desert. They twisted her arms behind her back, the transient atmosphere of the rest stop. She seemed not stranded, like him, but at peace, rooted, a part of this vast, indifferent landscape, not an unwilling trespasser upon it. He watched her for a moment, his metallic click of the handcuffs a sharp, ugly sound in the still, hot air. And then, they pushed her, roughly, unceremoniously, into the back of their patrol car, a silent, powerful woman reduced to a mere suspect, initial irritation momentarily eclipsed by a flicker of something else. Curiosity? Or perhaps a dawning, uncomfortable recognition of his own, a problem to be processed, a statistic in a system that so often seemed designed to crush, rather than to serve profound displacement, his own lack of belonging in this quiet, unassuming corner of the world. He was the powerful, influential. Judge Alistair Hayes watched the entire, sickening drama unfold, a cold, impotent fury rising within him. He was Judge Alistair Sterling. She was a woman at a rest stop. Yet in that moment, he felt a judge, a man of immense power, a guardian of the law. Yet here, in this desolate rest stop, stripped, strange, unsettling, and undeniable sense of his own insignificance, of his own powerlessness, in the face of her quiet of his robes, of his gavel, of the formal authority of his courtroom, he was just a witness, an unshakable serenity. The universe, it seemed, had a cruel and perhaps even instructive sense of humor, anonymous, powerless observer to a casual, brutal, and utterly profound act of injustice. He saw the patrol car pull. His day, already a study in frustration and inconvenience, was about to take a turn he could never have anticipated. Away, its lights still flashing, leaving behind only the battered, empty sedan, a silent, poignant testament to the woman turn that would challenge not just his patience, but his very understanding of justice, of power, and of the profound, often unseen, interrupted journey, and the lingering, acrid taste of a justice that had been not just blind, but deaf, dignity of the human spirit. The quiet woman at the picnic table, her name as yet unknown, her story and utterly, terrifyingly absent. The incident, so swift, so brutal, so ordinary, in a way that mystery was about to become an unwitting catalyst in a drama that would resonate far beyond the desolate confines of this forgotten rest, was perhaps the most chilling aspect of all. Left a deep, unsettling mark on Judge Hayes' soul. He returned stop, a drama that would ultimately find its way into the hallowed, hushed, and profoundly unprepared halls of Judge Alistair Sterling's own courtroom. The tranquility of the desolate rest stop was shattered by the sudden, aggressive skew to his car, the bottle of lukewarm water untouched, the classical piano concerto on the radio now sounding hollow, insipid, out of tires on asphalt. A county sheriff's patrol car, its paint faded, its bodywork bearing the scars of long, a pale, anemic echo of a world that no longer seemed to exist. The rest of his journey home was conducted. Hard use, skidded to a halt in the parking lot, its engine idling with a menacing rumble. Two officers in a heavy, brooding silence, his mind consumed by the image of the woman, of her quiet dignity, of the casual emerged, their movements imbued with a swaggering, almost theatrical, authority. The first, a burly man with a floor, brutal efficiency of the officers, of the profound, systemic injustice he had just witnessed. He, Alistair Hayes, the man who prided himself on his impartiality, on his detachment, on his unwavering commitment to the letter of the law, ID face, and a prominent gut that strained against the buttons of his uniform, was Deputy Henderson. The second, younger, found himself for the first time in a very long time, feeling something else. Something raw. Something personal. Leaner, with a nervous, almost twitchy energy, was Deputy Miller. They surveyed the scene with a proprietary air, something that felt disturbingly like rage. And he knew, with a chilling certainty, that this story, this encounter, was far from over. The wheels of justice he was about to discover sometimes turn in the most unexpected, and most profoundly their gazes sweeping over Alistair, who stood stiffly by his disabled luxury sedan, then lingering, with a new, almost predatory, interest on the quiet, unassuming figure of the woman at the picnic table. Alistair watched them approach, satisfying of ways. The following morning, Judge Alistair Hayes entered his courtroom. The familiar scent of old wood, leather-bound law books, and the faint, almost imperceptible scent of justice, both served and denied, filling his nostrils. The hushed, reverent atmosphere, The imposing grandeur of the bench, the respectful deference of the lawyers, and a familiar, weary sense of disapproval settling over him. He had seen this type before, in his courtroom, on the witness stand. Men who mistook their badges for crowns, whose authority was a blunt instrument, whose understanding of the law was often as limited as their capacity for empathy. They moved not with the quiet confidence of true law enforcement officers, but with the insecure court staff. All of it, for the first time in years, felt different. The memory of the previous day, bluster of men who felt the need to constantly, and often aggressively, assert their dominance. They ignored Alistair. Their incident at the desert rest stop had cast a long, unsettling shadow over his usually ordered, dispassionate world. Attention focused solely on the woman. Well, Deputy Henderson began, his voice a low, condensed the image of the woman, her quiet dignity in the face of such casual, brutal injustice, haunted him a stark, ending drawl, his hand resting casually on the butt of his holstered firearm. What have we here? Miller, uncomfortable reminder of the chasm that so often existed between the idealized principles of the law and the harsh, messy realities of it. Looks like we got ourselves a loiter. The woman looked up from her book, her expression calm, her dark application. He took his seat on the bench, his face a mask of its usual calm, judicial authority, though his eyes holding a quiet, unwavering intelligence that seemed to disconcert the two officers. She did not speak. She simply met. There was a turmoil of conflicting emotions. He glanced at the day's docket, a routine list of preliminary hearings, a rain gaze, a silent, powerful challenge to their presumptive authority. "Ma'am," Deputy Miller said, his voice a little tumult in procedural motions. His gaze fell upon a particular case. The People versus Alana Vance. A routine traffic stop, escalated to a charge of resisting arrest and failure to comply with a lawful order. The High, a little too eager to assert his own, newly minted authority. "We've had reports arresting officers, Deputy Miller and Deputy Henderson." The name, Alana Vance, struck him with the force of a physical blow of suspicious activity in this area. "We're going to need to see some identification." The woman slowly, deliberately closed her. It was her, the woman from the rest stop. His heart gave a strange, unsettling lurch. Coincidence? Look, her movements graceful, unhurried. And what suspicious activity would that be, officer? She inquired, or a strange, almost fated confluence of events. He looked at the details of the police report, his eyes, her voice a low, resonant contralto, calm, clear, and utterly devoid of fear. Reading a book at scanning the dry, dispassionate, and utterly self-serving language. The report, as he had expected, painted a picture of public rest stop, or perhaps the very act of my existence in this particular location is what you deem of a combative, uncooperative suspect, of a routine stop that had been unnecessarily escalated by suspicious. Her words, so direct, so articulate, so utterly devoid of the deference they clearly expected, seemed to throw her defiant and aggressive behavior. It was a narrative he had seen 1,000 times, a carefully constructed fictionum off balance. Henderson's florid face darkened. "You got a smart mouth on you, don't you?" He designed to justify the exercise of power, to sanitize the reality of prejudice, to transform a victim into a perpetrator. A sneered, taking a step closer, his bulk looming over her. "I suggest you lose the attitude and show us your ID cold, quiet anger," the likes of which he hadn't felt in years, began to simmer beneath his calm. "Now," the woman sighed, a faint, almost weary exhalation. "I'm not required to provide you judicial exterior." "All rise," the bailiff's voice boomed, echoing through the courtroom. "The door's out with identification, officer," she stated, her voice still calm, but now imbued with a quiet, unyielding authority. That the back of the courtroom opened, and a group of defendants, clad in the drab, ill-fitting orange jumpsuits of that was based not on a badge, but on a profound, unshakable understanding of the law. I am county jail, were led in, their ankles shackled, their faces a mixture of fear, resignation, and a weary in a public space. I'm not operating a motor vehicle, and you have not articulated any reasonable suspicion that I have committed defiant pride. Among them was Alana Vance. Her elegant braids were slightly disheveled, her face pale with, or am about to commit, a crime. Therefore, your demand is unlawful. Alistair, watching from exhaustion, but her posture, even in the demeaning confines of her prison jumpsuit, was erect, her gaze steady, her quiet short distance, felt a flicker of grudging admiration. She was right. Absolutely, unequivocally right. She knew her rights, dignity undiminished. Her eyes, as she was led to the defendant's table, swept briefly over the courtroom, and she was articulating them with a precision that would have done a seasoned defense attorney proud. Henderson and Miller, however, were clearly, and for a fleeting, heart-stopping moment, they met Judge Hayes's. A flicker of something, recognition, confusion, not accustomed to being challenged, particularly not by her. A black woman, alone, at a desolate rest stop. Passed through them, before she quickly looked away, her gaze dropping to the floor. Did she recognize him? The man from their world, in their minds. She was an easy target, a person to be intimidated, to be controlled, to rest stop, the anonymous witness to her humiliation. He couldn't be sure. The two arresting officers, Deputy Miller and Deputy Henderson, be put in her place. Her calm, articulate, and legally sound refusal was an affront to their authority, a challenge to, were also present, seated at the prosecution's table, their expressions a mixture of smug self-assurance and of their ingrained prejudices. Unlawful. Henderson scoffed, a harsh, ugly laugh erupting from his chest. Listen, barely concealed contempt for the suspects they had brought to justice. They looked up at Judge Hayes with a her Miller. She thinks she's a lawyer. Lady, I don't care what you think. The easy familiarity of men who were accustomed to having their version of events accepted without question, who saw the courtroom not as a forum law is. I'm a law out here, and I say you show me some ID, where you're coming for truth, but as a stage for the ratification of their own, often biased, authority. Judge Hayes looked at them, with us, for vagrancy, and resisting an investigation. That would be an unlawful arrest, officer. Their mirrored sunglasses at their confident, almost arrogant, demeanor, and he remembered the way they had pulled Alana Vance from her. The woman replied, her voice still maddeningly calm. And you know it. You have no probable cause for a vagrancy charge. I am not soliciting. I am not homeless. I am simply resting. At a rest car, the casual, brutal efficiency of their actions, and the cold anger within him solidified into a quiet, unyielding resolve. Today, he was not just a detached arbiter of the law. He was a witness. He was a guardian of a stop, the very purpose for which this facility was created. The tension crackled, a palpable, dangerous thing, truth that had been systematically and deliberately distorted. The people versus Alana Vance. The clerk announced, his voice Astaire knew he should intervene. He was, after all, a federal judge. His word, his presence, would immediately dethrone emotionless charges of resisting arrest and failure to comply with a lawful order. The prosecutor, a young, escalate the situation, but a small, almost perverse part of him, the part that was a lifelong student of a law-ambitious man named Thorne, rose to his feet. Your Honor, he began, his voice smooth, confident. The of human nature was curious. He wanted to see how this would play out. He wanted to see the full extent of this woman's quiet courage, of these officers' blatant, arrogant abuse of power. It was a detached people are prepared to proceed. The facts of the case are quite straightforward. The defendant, Miss Vance, was pulled over for a almost academic curiosity, but one that he would in the very near future come to deeply, profoundly routine traffic violation. She became uncooperative, and her subsequent actions necessitated the use of reasonable force to effect a lawful arrest. The arresting officers, Deputies Miller and Henderson, are here to testify to that effect. Judge Hayes listened, his regret. The situation escalated quickly. Henderson, his face now a mottled, furious red, his authority openly and correctly face an impassive mask, his gaze fixed on the prosecutor, then on the two deputies, then on Alana Vance, who, challenged, decided to resort to the one tool he truly understood: force. "That's it," he roared, sat, silent and dignified, at the defendant's table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The stage, his hand moving from his firearm to his handcuffs. "You're under arrest for obstructing an officer," was set. The familiar, often predictable drama of the courtroom was about to unfold. But today there was he lunged forward, grabbing the woman's arm, his grip rough, brutal. The woman did not resist, did unknown variable in the equation. Today, the judge, the supposedly impartial arbiter, was also a witness. And the scales not struggle. She simply looked at him, her dark eyes filled not with fear, but with a profound, almost pitying disappointment. "You are making a grave mistake, officer," she said, her voice a low, sad whisper. Miller of justice, so often tipped in favor of power, of authority, of the carefully constructed narratives of those in uniform, were about to, his own adrenaline surging, move to assist, his hands fumbling with his own set of handcuffs. They roughly be subjected to a profound and entirely unexpected rebalancing. The Arctic fox of the courtroom, the man known for his cold, dispassionate adherence to the letter of the law, was about to be guided by something else entirely. With an entirely unnecessary level of force, pulled her to her feet, wrenching her arms behind her back, the unyielding, undeniable, and deeply personal power of the truth. The preliminary hearing for Alana Vance began as so metal of the handcuffs clicking shut with a grim finality. They did not read her rights. They did not ask, many did, with a dry, almost perfunctory recitation of the official narrative. The prosecutor, Thorne, called deputy her any further questions. They simply, brutally, asserted their power over a person they deemed powerless. As they began Miller to the stand. Miller, a burly man with a florid face and an air of swaggering self-importance, to march her towards their patrol car, a triumphant, ugly smirk on Henderson's face. The woman's gaze took the oath with a casual confidence, his hand barely touching the Bible. He recounted his version of the events at, for the first time, met Alistair's. She looked at him, the well-dressed, powerful the rest stop, his testimony a well-rehearsed litany of police jargon and self-serving justifications. He spoke-looking man, standing silently by his luxury sedan, the man who had watched the entire, unjust, unlawful spectacle unfold, and had of Alana Vance's erratic driving, a claim for which there was no evidence, of her done nothing. Her eyes held no plea, no accusation, only a profound, quiet, and utterly damning disappointment. An end of movements, a classic all-purpose justification for escalating a routine stop, of her belligerent and on that moment, Alistair Sterling, the formidable federal judge, the man who had built his life, his career on cooperative attitude when questioned. She refused to provide her license and registration in a timely manner. Your Honor, Miller, the unshakable foundations of law and justice, felt a wave of shame so profound, so overwhelming, that almost stated, his voice ringing with a false sincerity. She became verbally abusive. We had reason to believe she might be, buckled his knees. He had been a silent, complicit witness to a gross, undeniable injustice. And under the influence or concealing something. For our own safety, and for hers, we had no choice but to memory of that quiet, disappointed gaze he knew would haunt him. Far more, he suspected, than the inconvenience restrain her. Judge Hayes listened, his expression an unreadable mask of judicial neutrality, though inside, a cold quiet of his broken-down car. The quiet woman at the picnic table had been arrested, and Judge Alistair Sterling fury was building. Every word from Deputy Miller's mouth was a distortion, a lie, a carefully constructed fiction designed to legit. The man who held the scales of justice in his hands had simply watched. The irony was as bitter, implies an act of pure, unadulterated prejudice. He remembered the scene vividly. Alana Vance, sitting quietly as searing as the relentless afternoon sun. The tow truck, when it finally arrived, felt like an emissary from in her car, her only crime being her presence, the color of her skin, in a place where these officers a different, more rational universe. The driver, a lanky young man with oil-stained hands and a surprisingly cheerful, felt she didn't belong. He remembered her quiet dignity, her calm, measured responses, a stark contrast to the demeanor. Loaded Alistair's dead sedan with a practiced, almost balletic, efficiency, his presence a jarring contrast to the ugly, brutal drama that had just unfolded. Alistair rode in the cab of the tow truck, the aggressive, escalating demands of the two deputies. Next, Deputy Henderson, Miller's younger, more impressionable partner, took the smell of stale coffee and cheap air freshener a welcome, if somewhat surreal, respite from the oppressive atmosphere of the rest stand. His testimony was a near-perfect echo of Miller's, a well-rehearsed chorus of justification stop. He was silent for most of the journey to the nearest town, his mind replaying the scene of the woman, of insubstantial suspicions, of a narrative that painted Alana Vance not as a victim, but as a perpetrator's arrest, her quiet dignity, her legally sound arguments, the officer's arrogant, aggressive abuse of power, and, most damning, a woman whose defiance had necessitated her own arrest. Judge Hayes watched Henderson's face, saw the faint flicker of unease in his eyes, the subtle tremor in his hand as he gestured, a telltale sign of his own, inexplicable inaction. Shame, a cold, unfamiliar, and deeply uncomfortable emotion, gnawed at him. A man who was not entirely comfortable with the lies he was telling, a man who was, perhaps, more a follower than a true, he was a judge. He was sworn to uphold the law, to protect the innocent, to ensure that justice was administered, believer in the toxic culture of his department. Finally, Alana Vance's court-appointed public defender, a young, fairly, impartially. Yet he had stood by a silent, privileged observer, while two thuggish, prejudiced, overworked, and clearly outmatched, woman named Albright, rose to her feet. She did her best, cross-examining the officers had trampled on the constitutional rights of a citizen, their actions a textbook example of racial profiling and unlawful arrest. Why two officers? But her questions were easily parried, her attempts to poke holes in their narrative easily deflected by their well hadn't he intervened. The question tormented him. Was it fear? No. He had faced down far more dangerous men than Henderson and Miller in his courtroom. Was it arrogance? A sense of detachment, of being above the fray, of not wanting rehearsed, impenetrable wall of police procedure and officer safety rhetoric. It was a depressingly familiar dance, a legal charade that Judge Hayes had witnessed countless times, a system designed to protect its own, to ratify the exercise, to involve himself in a sordid, small-town dispute? Or was it something worse? A subtle, almost unconscious of power, regardless of its legitimacy. He looked at Alana Vance. She sat, silent and composed, throughout the entire complicity, a tacit acceptance of the ugly, unspoken power dynamics that had played out so clearly before his eyes. He, the wealthy white man in the bespoke suit, had been left untouched, unquestioned, while she, the quiet Presiding, her face a mask of weary resignation, her eyes holding a profound, heartbreaking sadness, the sadness of a woman, unassuming black woman, had been targeted, harassed, and ultimately arrested for the simple, audacious act of existing, who had clearly been through this before, who knew the futility of fighting a system that was so profoundly, so systematically in a space where they deemed she did not belong. The thought was a bitter, indigestible pill he had spent stacked against her. Then, it was her turn to speak. Ms. Albright called her to the stand. Alana Vance, his career, dissecting the complexities of the law, of justice, of human behavior, from the rarefied, intellectual heights, walked to the witness box, her movements slow, deliberate, her shackled ankles a stark, brutal reminder of her current of the federal bench. But today he had been confronted with the raw, unvarnished reality of injustice, not demeaning reality. She took the oath, her voice quiet but clear, her gaze, for a brief moment, meeting Judge Hayes's. He saw in her eyes not fear, not anger, but a profound, weary, and utterly as a legal abstract, but as a visceral human experience. And he had failed the test. Profoundly. Unshakable dignity. Her testimony was a simple, unadorned account of the truth. She spoke of her long, small town. When they finally reached it, was a sleepy, sun-bleached place, its main street lined with drive, of her decision to pull over at the rest stop to rest her tired eyes, of the sudden, aggressive approach fading storefronts and a single, blinking traffic light. The tow truck driver, whose name was Davies, dropped him, and of the two officers. She spoke of her confusion, of her attempts to comply with their increasingly contradictory demands, of her his disabled car at the town's only garage, a dusty, cluttered place run by a grizzled old mechanic named Jorge, growing fear as their questioning grew more hostile, more accusatory. She spoke not with anger, but with a quiet, almost heartbreaking, who informed him, with a distinct lack of urgency, that the necessary parts for his foreign luxury car would have to, sadness, the sadness of a woman who had, once again, been judged not by her actions, but by the be ordered, and would likely take a few days, maybe a week, depending. Alistair, his frustration color of her skin, by the age of her car, by the unspoken, insidious prejudices of those in power. The now a dull, secondary ache beneath the sharper sting of his shame. Checked into the town's only motel, a faded prosecutor, Thorne, cross-examined her with a barely concealed contempt, his questions designed to trip her up, to paint her, slightly seedy establishment called the Sleepy Hollow, a name that seemed both ironic and depressingly apartment. The room as inconsistent, as unreliable, as the angry black woman stereotype that was so often, and so effectively, used was small, clean, but smelled faintly of stale cigarette smoke and pine-scented disinfectant. He spent the rest of the day to discredit women of color in the courtroom. But Alana Vance did not rise to the bait. She answered his questions within a state of restless, self-recriminating limbo, his meticulously planned schedule, his important meetings, his entire, quiet, unwavering honesty, her dignity a silent, powerful rebuke to his cynical, manipulative tactics. When her testimony was complete, ordered world, now utterly, and perhaps deservedly, upended, he tried to work, to review the legal. A heavy silence descended on the courtroom. The facts had been presented, the narratives, both true and false, had been laid bare. Briefs he carried in his expensive leather briefcase, but the words blurred before his eyes, the complex legal arguments seeming hollow. It was now up to Judge Hayes to render his judgment. The prosecutor, Thorne, smug and confident, clearly believed the meaningless, in the face of the stark, simple injustice he had witnessed. He thought of the woman, of her quiet outcome, was a foregone conclusion. The deputies, Miller and Henderson, looked equally assured, their expressions a mixture of relief, courage, of her profound, disappointed gaze. He didn't even know her name. He wondered where she was now, in a faint, contemptuous amusement. Ms. Albright, the public defender, looked defeated, resigned to the inevitable injustice. In a small, cold holding cell at the local sheriff's department, facing a trumped-up charge, a hostile of a system she was powerless to change. And Alana Vance simply waited, her face a mask of weary judge, a system that was in all likelihood as biased, as prejudiced, as the two officers who had arrested, stoic and profoundly dignified, resignation. Judge Hayes looked at them all, at the players in this small, but her. The thought was a torment. He was a federal judge. He had power. He could make a phone call, profoundly significant courtroom drama. He looked at the lies, the prejudice, the systemic injustice that had brought Alana Vance to pull some strings, ensure that she was treated fairly, that her rights were protected. But he hadn't. This point. And he thought of his own role, his own responsibility, as a guardian of the law, as it had remained silent, complicit, a part of the very system that had so unjustly, so callously, stripped her of her freedom arbiter of truth. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the silent courtroom. The time for judicial detachment. As night fell, casting long, mournful shadows across the small, sleepy town, Alastair Sterling sat alone for dispassionate impartiality, was over. The time for truth, for justice, for a profound and entirely necessary reckoning in his cheap motel room, the blinking neon sign outside his window casting a lurid, intermittent glow on the peeling wallpaper, had arrived. Deputies Miller and Henderson. Judge Hayes began, his voice quiet, but imbued with anew. He felt a profound sense of self-loathing, a feeling so alien, so unsettling, that it shook him to his very, almost chilling, authority that made the two officers sit up a little straighter, a flicker of unease in their eyes' core. He had spent his life judging others, weighing their actions, their motivations, their guilt, their innocence. But, could you please approach the bench? The stage was set. The game was about to change. In the Arctic fox of tonight, for the first time in a very long time, he found himself in the dock. The subject of his own, the courtroom was about to deliver a verdict that would not just decide the fate of Alana Vance, but would send shockwaves silent and utterly damning judgment. And the verdict, he knew, was guilty. Guilty of inaction. Guilty of conflict through the entire, complacent, and deeply compromised local justice system. Deputies Miller and Henderson approached the bench, Heari, guilty of a profound and perhaps unforgivable failure of his most sacred, most fundamental duty. Not initial swagger replaced by a dawning, uncertain apprehension. Judge Hayes's tone, his quiet, almost chilling authority, was just as a judge, but as a human being. The quiet woman at the rest stop had been arrested. And a part of Judge Alastair Sterling's soul, he realized with a chilling certainty, had been arrested along with her. Not what they had expected. They were accustomed to a certain professional deference from the bench, a tacit understanding, an unspoken. The next morning, Alastair Sterling awoke from a restless, dream-haunted sleep with a new, unshakable resolve. Alliance between law enforcement and the judiciary. This felt different. Deputies, Judge Hayes began, his voice the shame, the self-recrimination of the previous day had coalesced into a cold, hard determination. He could still quiet, but now laced with an icy precision that made the air in the courtroom seem to crackle. I have listened not undo his inaction at the rest stop. But he could, and he would do something now. He would find your testimony with great interest. And I find myself with a few, shall we say, clarifying questions. He paused the woman. He would offer her his assistance, his legal expertise, his influence. He would ensure that the injustice she had suffered, his gaze, like a surgeon's scalpel, dissecting the two men before him. Deputy Miller was not compounded by a corrupt, biased legal system. It was the least he could do. Aid clinic in an underserved neighborhood, a clinic funded discreetly from his own personal fortune, a clinic dedicated to providing top-tier legal representation to those who, like Alana Vance, found themselves ensnared in a system that so often seemed designed to crush rather than to serve. He never saw Alana Vance again. Their connection, their profound, unspoken understanding, remained a silent, powerful memory, a touchstone in his own journey of transformation. He did, however, follow her story discreetly from a distance. He learned, through quiet inquiries, that Alana, emboldened by her experience, by the unexpected, miraculous intervention of justice, had decided to pursue a long-deferred dream. She enrolled in law school. Her sharp intellect, her quiet dignity, her profound, first-hand understanding of injustice, making her a formidable and deeply compassionate student of the law. He learned that she graduated at the top of her class, that she turned down lucrative offers from prestigious corporate law firms, choosing instead to work as a public defender, a passionate, tireless advocate for the voiceless, the marginalized, the forgotten. She became a warrior for justice, her own harrowing experience a constant, driving force, a reminder of the profound, transformative power of a single, principled voice, of a single act of courage in the face of overwhelming injustice. Judge Alastair Hayes, sitting in his quiet, lonely study, reading of her accomplishments, would often allow himself a faint, almost imperceptible smile. The Arctic fox of the courtroom, the man who had once believed only in the cold, hard letter of the law, had learned, through a chance encounter at a desolate desert rest stop, a profound and ultimately liberating truth that justice is not merely an abstract concept, not merely a set of rules and statutes. It is a living, breathing thing, a thing that requires not just intellect, but empathy, not just impartiality, but a fierce, unwavering, and sometimes deeply personal commitment to the truth. And in that truth, he had found not just the redemption of a single, wronged woman, but the quiet, profound, and deeply satisfying redemption of his own soul. The scales of justice, he had learned, are not balanced by laws alone, but by the courage, the compassion, and the unwavering integrity of the human hearts that weigh them. The years that followed saw Alana Vance's ascent within the legal community become the stuff of quiet, almost mythical legend. She was a force to be reckoned with, a public defender whose quiet dignity, whose sharp intellect, whose unwavering commitment to her clients earned her the grudging respect of prosecutors, the profound admiration of her colleagues. And the UND? Or perhaps the fact that she was a woman, alone, in a place where you, in your professional judgment, deemed she did not belong. The words hung in the air, a stark, damning indictment of the unspoken prejudices that had driven their actions. Miller stammered, his face a mottled, terrified red. He had no answer. There was no answer. Judge Thorne then turned her gaze back to the defendant, the woman known to the court as Alana Hayes. "Miss Hayes," she said, her voice now softening almost imperceptibly, a flicker of something human entering her judicial gaze. "You have heard the testimony of these two officers. You have heard the charges against you. Do you have anything to say in your own defense?" Alana Hayes, a.k.a. Judge Serafina Thorne, rose to her feet, her movements graceful, unhurried, a quiet, powerful dignity radiating from her. She looked not at the two cowering deputies, not at the flustered district attorney, but directly at the woman on the bench, her colleague, her peer, her silent, unwitting accomplice in this strange, profound, and utterly necessary act of judicial theater. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, her voice a low, resonant contralto, calm, clear, and utterly, devastatingly powerful. "I have a great deal to say, and I believe the court will find my testimony most illuminating." The final act of this extraordinary drama was about to begin, and Alastair Sterling, sitting in the back of the courtroom, felt a profound, almost spiritual sense of dread and a dawning, reluctant, and deeply humbling admiration for the woman who was about to deliver a masterclass in the true and often painful meaning of justice. The courtroom fell into a hushed, expectant silence as Alana Hayes, her expression calm, her gaze unwavering, began to speak. Her voice, that low, resonant contralto that Alastair Sterling now recognized with a dawning, horrified clarity, filled the small, shabby room, not with the hesitant, fearful tones of a defendant, but with the quiet, unshakable authority of a woman who was in absolute and utter command. "Your Honor," she began, addressing Judge Thorne with a subtle, almost imperceptible flicker of professional camaraderie in her eyes, "the testimony of Deputy Henderson and Deputy Miller is, I am afraid, a work of fiction, a narrative crafted not from facts, but from a potent and deeply disturbing cocktail of prejudice, assumption, and a flagrant abuse of power." A gasp went through the courtroom. The district attorney, Davies, leaped to his feet, his face a mask of indignation. "Objection, Your Honor. The defendant is maligning the character of these two fine officers." Judge Thorne simply raised a hand, a silent, dismissive gesture that sent Davies slumping back into his chair. "Overruled, Mr. Davies," she said, her voice cool, level. "The defendant will be allowed to speak." I am most interested in hearing her perspective on the events in question. Alana Hayes continued, her voice gaining strength, her words precise, articulate, a devastatingly effective dismantling of the deputy's flimsy case. I was not loitering with intent, Your Honor, she stated, her gaze sweeping over the jury box, then settling, with a quiet, damning intensity, on Henderson and Miller. I was reading a book, a collection of essays on constitutional law, as it happens. A rather dry, but surprisingly relevant text, given the circumstances. She paused, letting the irony of her words sink in. I was not a vagrant. I was a traveler, experiencing a temporary and rather inconvenient mechanical failure of my vehicle. A vehicle, I might add, that was parked legally and in plain sight, just a few yards from where I was sitting. She then turned her attention to the charge of obstructing an officer. I did not obstruct these officers, Your Honor, she said, her voice taking on a new, almost pedagogical tone. I merely educated them. I informed them, politely and accurately, of my constitutional rights. I explained that, in the absence of any reasonable suspicion of criminal activity, their demand for my identification was unlawful. I explained that their threat of a vagrancy charge was without legal merit. I was not belligerent. I was correct. The two deputies squirmed, their faces a mixture of fury, humiliation, and a dawning, terrifying realization that they were no longer dealing with a powerless, easily intimidated vagrant. They were dealing with something else entirely. And as for the charge of resisting arrest, Your Honor, Alana continued, her voice now imbued with a quiet, righteous anger, I did not resist. I submitted peacefully to an unlawful seizure, knowing that the proper venue for redress was not a desolate rest stop, but a court of law. A court where, I had hoped, the principles of justice, of due process, of the fundamental, inalienable rights of every citizen, regardless of their race, their gender, or their perceived station in life, would be upheld. Her gaze, for a fleeting, electrifying moment, met Alastair Sterling's in the back of the courtroom. Her eyes held no anger, no accusation, only a profound, quiet, and utterly devastating question. And where were you, Judge Sterling, when those principles were being so flagrantly, so brutally violated? Alastair felt the silent question like a physical blow, a searing indictment of his own moral failure. He looked away, unable to meet her gaze, the shame a hot, suffocating wave. Alana Hayes then turned her attention back to Judge Thorne. Your Honor, she said, her voice now softening, but losing none of its power, this case is not about me. It is not about a misplaced book, or a broken-down car, or a trumped-up charge of vagrancy. It is about the ingratitude of the countless individuals she represented, the voiceless, the marginalized, the forgotten. She became a champion for systemic reform, a powerful advocate for a more just, more equitable, and more human legal system, her own harrowing experience a constant, driving force behind her tireless efforts. Judge Alastair Hayes, from the quiet remove of his own courtroom, watched her progress with a deep, almost paternal pride. He saw in her not just a brilliant legal mind, but a kindred spirit, a fellow warrior in the long, arduous battle for justice. He never spoke of their chance encounter at the desert rest stop, never revealed his role as the anonymous witness who had so profoundly, so irrevocably changed the trajectory of her life. Their connection remained a silent, unspoken bond, a quiet, powerful undercurrent in the vast, often turbulent sea of the legal world. He continued his own, quiet, internal revolution, his courtroom becoming a place not just of legal judgment, but of profound, often surprising, human connection. He listened, truly listened, to the stories of those who appeared before him. His judgments, while still rooted in the firm principles of the law, now imbued with a new, almost surprising compassion, a deeper understanding of the complex, often heartbreaking, human dramas that lay behind the dry, legalistic facts of each case. His pro bono clinic, funded by his discreet, anonymous donations, thrived, becoming a beacon of hope, a sanctuary of justice, in a community that had long been abandoned by the very system designed to protect it. It was a testament to his own transformation, to his own hard-won understanding of the true meaning of justice. Then, one day, nearly a decade after their first fateful encounter, their paths crossed again. It was in Judge Hayes' own courtroom. A complex, high-profile civil rights case. A case that had captured the attention of the entire nation. A case that pitted a small, struggling community against a powerful, ruthless corporation. A case that had been assigned, by a twist of fate, to Judge Hayes' court. The lead counsel for the community, the woman who had, against all odds, brought the case this far, the woman whose brilliant legal arguments, whose passionate, eloquent advocacy had captivated the media and inspired a generation of young, idealistic lawyers, was Alana Vance. She stood before him, no longer the terrified, shackled defendant in a prison jumpsuit, but a powerful, confident, and profoundly, beautifully dignified advocate for justice. Her dark eyes shining with a fierce, unwavering intelligence, her voice, once so quiet, now ringing with a clear, resonant, and utterly compelling authority. She did not acknowledge their past connection. She did not need to. Their shared history, their unspoken bond, hung in the air between them, a silent, powerful testament to the strange, unpredictable, and often profoundly redemptive journey of their lives. Judge Hayes presided over the case with his customary scrupulous fairness, his impartiality unwavering, his gaze, when it rested on Alana Vance, betraying nothing of the profound, almost overwhelming, emotion that stirred within him. He watched her, he listened to her, he saw the brilliant, compassionate, and utterly indomitable woman she had become, and he felt a sense of pride, of hope, of a profound, almost spiritual satisfaction that transcended any professional accomplishment he had ever achieved. The case, as expected, was long, arduous, a brutal, high-stakes battle of legal wits and corporate power. But Alana Vance was relentless. She was brilliant. She was magnificent. And in the end, she won. A landmark victory, a stunning triumph for the underdog, a powerful, undeniable affirmation of the very principles of justice to which she and Judge Hayes had dedicated their lives. After the verdict was read, after the courtroom had erupted in a joyous, emotional pandemonium, after the reporters had been satisfied, after the last of the celebrating community members had departed, Alana Vance remained. She stood in the now empty courtroom, her gaze fixed on Judge Hayes, who still sat, silent and composed, on the bench. He looked at her, at the woman whose life he had so profoundly, so unexpectedly changed, at the woman who had, in turn, so profoundly, so unexpectedly changed him. A slow, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. Alana Vance smiled back, a smile of profound, unspoken, and utterly mutual gratitude. "Thank you, Judge Hayes," she said softly, her voice echoing in the silent courtroom, a quiet, powerful acknowledgement of the debt she could never repay, of the connection they would always share. "No, Ms. Vance," Judge Hayes replied, his own voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to suppress. "Thank you." He banged his gavel, one last time, the sound sharp, final, a perfect, resonant, and profoundly satisfying conclusion to a story that had begun on a desolate desert highway, with a casual, brutal act of injustice, and had ended here, in this hallowed hall, with a quiet, powerful, and utterly beautiful triumph of the human spirit. The law, he had learned, was not just a set of rules. It was a story of struggle, of hope, of the relentless, unwavering, and often profoundly surprising pursuit of a more just, more compassionate, and more human world. And he and Alana Vance were now and forever a part of that magnificent, ongoing, and ultimately deeply hopeful story.